You've talked about threats from military systems and from social and economic systems, but I wonder if you could address specifically ecological threats to the future of the species which will grow out of those social and economic systems.
Well, the ecological, the only reason I didn't talk about the ecological threats is because they're so obvious. I mean, if you have a really functioning market system, if such a monstrosity were permitted to survive, which of course it never is, a market system is one in which your dollar is your vote, right? You got as many votes as you have dollars. And the system, if it's functioning properly, is supposed to respond to your votes. Well, if you have 0 votes, $0, 0 votes. Unborn generations have $0. Okay? So therefore, what happens to them is of 0 significance in a market system. 0. Okay, well, what's done today, they got to live with, right? I mean, if we destroy resources or something, well, they're going to have to live with it. But they don't have anything to say about it in a properly functioning market system. Okay? So therefore, to the limited extent that market systems are allowed to function, they're just guaranteed to self-destruct. No, it's kind of like a guarantee. I mean, maybe if it was a small enough system, it could survive for a while, but not for very long. And that's why if you take a look at modern history, at least in rich and developed countries that were more or less organized and functioning, they never allowed market systems to function. In Britain, there was an experiment with laissez-faire around the 1860s and 1870s. It was called off very quickly by the business world because they saw it's going to wipe out communities and the environment. So they called it off and they instituted a kind of social democratic system. I mean, there's a classic book about this, which, it's so good, it's admired by everybody all across the political spectrum. It's kind of like a real classic. That's Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation. It was written about 50 years ago and been reprinted a couple of times. It's pretty much about the 19th century, the background for it, and then the experiment with laissez-faire, and then the calling off of the experiment. In fact, the only countries that ever followed market systems were the ones that had it rammed down their throat by force. So like India followed a market system, but that's because Britain conquered it, and forced it to follow a market system, and it destroyed the country. Actually, this is, all this business with China right now. Nobody can figure out why China is so angry. Well, take a look at Chinese history, you understand exactly why they're angry. As late as remember that Europe was a backwater. I mean, the main commercial and industrial centers of the world were Asia. India and China in particular were major commercial and industrial centers in the 18th century. England couldn't compete with them. England succeeded in crushing India by highly protectionist programs of its own, like very high tariffs to keep out Indian goods, and imposing free market principles on India, which of course wiped it out. They just did it by force. So, for 2 centuries, India didn't develop, probably declined. It didn't begin developing again until after independence. But they hadn't conquered China. And as late as around 1860, the British were still unable to compete with the Chinese. You read the reports of British attachés in Hong Kong, which they had conquered. They're concerned because you can't sell anything to China because what they make is better. Like, they don't want Lancashire textiles because they make better textiles. And other things they just don't care about. But Britain did want things from China, like it wanted tea. They were stealing Chinese tea plants to plant them in India, which were extremely important. They were part of the way of pacifying the British working class, tea and sugar. That's why the Caribbean was so important. Soft drugs were required during the Industrial Revolution to sort of keep people down. And tea was a big part of it, and silk and various other things. And they couldn't break into the China market because they just couldn't do it. Well, there was one way they could do it: narco-trafficking. They could do it with narco-trafficking. This started a century earlier. In fact, Adam Smith was already condemning the British in India for forcing the peasants to produce opium, poppies, instead of crops. He said the British are turning dearth into famine in India, the big famine in Bengal, which Smith correctly blamed on the British imperial powers, which were trying to get opium. They were trying to get it into China. Well, the Chinese blocked it. They were an organized society. Britain did fight a war in 1840, the first opium war, to try to break it down, and it didn't quite work. In 1860, around 1860, came the second opium war. And Britain did succeed, not just Britain, you know, the whole of the United States was involved, and everybody. It was mainly Britain. They were the big guys in those days. They did succeed in breaking open the Chinese market and selling them the one thing they could sell them, namely opium. Okay, a large part of the conquest of India was for the same purpose. They wanted to conquer India so they could get a monopoly of opium production. Opium was produced in Turkey and all sorts of places, but they wanted a monopoly. And a good part of the conquest of India around that time, in the 50s and the 60s, was to gain a monopoly of the opium traffic, which they could then force into China. You know, and of course, you know, you can sell opium, and that was a good that the Chinese were essentially compelled to accept. And it ended up with a kind of a market system, except that the British had a near monopoly on the marketing. And it ended up destroying China. You know, then the other imperial countries came in and took their pieces and so on and so forth. I mean, China didn't forget this. We may want to forget it, but they didn't. And it was no small thing. The British Empire depended very heavily on narco-trafficking. The profits from drugs, first of all, they funded the British Navy. They covered all the costs of the British Navy, which was the basis for the empire. They funded all the costs of the administration of India, you know, which is a big thing. And they also financed the purchase of cotton from the United States, which was, cotton is kind of like oil in those days. You know, it's the main commodity in world trade. And they had to get it from the United States, which was first produced by slaves, later by so-called semi-slaves. And they, this financed it. It was the core of the British imperial system. This is during the so-called free trade period. Okay, so this huge narco-trafficking enterprise with China at the center of it was what kept the whole imperial system going for Britain. And that was the global system. You know, everybody else had empires, but small ones by comparison. These are no small things. So they ended up having a market and getting destroyed. Okay. Meanwhile, every industrial country, including the United States, violated market principles radically. I mean, and still does to this day. You know. The third world is what was called an ocean of liberalism by economic historians. And it's good reason, part of the reason why it became the third world. You know. And you can see the same processes at work right now, to the limited extent that these systems are allowed to function. But getting back to the ecological thing where we started, I mean, there it's just transparent. I mean, if a market system really functions, it's going to wipe out the environment. Therefore, any technique of saving the environment, caring about the environment, has got to be market interference. You know, regulations or something. And you can prettify it in any way you like. You can say you're internalizing the costs or play some other game. But the fact of the matter is it's regulation. It's a communal decision, you know, to do something about making sure that our children can live. It's essentially the core of the environment, our environmental movement. If you don't have that, yeah, they're not going to live. There are differences, I don't think they're overwhelming, between the Clinton and the Bush business communities. And yeah, the Bush guys are less concerned about whether anybody lives in the next generation. And you can see that in, you know, decision after decision. You know, so like, what's her name? Christine Todd Whitman gets up on television and says that she's read the National Academy of Sciences report of a 10-year study on arsenic and in water, and she decided it isn't good science. Okay. I mean, it isn't good science because the chemical companies don't like it. And people are supposed to watch her on television say that and not laugh, you know. Yeah, okay, so there'll be more arsenic in the water, so, you know, kids will die. But that's somewhere down the road, who cares? Meanwhile, the chemical companies make profits tomorrow. And the same is true on decision after decision. So sure, the relation between environments and markets is very clear. And the same thing is true of the Kyoto Protocol. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol is not much, but it's something. And it's true, it would probably cut down it's not even obvious, but it might cut down short-term profits. I mean, if it was instituted, there'd be a way of making profit on it, pollution control devices and so on. But in the short term, it's probably not what every CEO would like. So therefore, the Bush administration is just dismantling it. And in this case, they're really infuriating the whole world. I mean, even Europe is going berserk.